Welcome to the Two World Podcast, where you can hear thoughts and reflections on unique intersections between faith and culture. Tune in regularly for this foray into feelings of surprise and interconnectedness and aha moments in life when two worlds come together. Now join your hosts, Barney and Jacob, for this most recent episode.
All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Two World Podcast. Once again, I'm Barney, and I will be in charge of the hosting duties today. In our last episode, we uncovered that myself and Jacob, we have a mutual affinity for and an attraction to overseas travel. And we heard some of my story and how my time with the Mennonite Central Committee in Thailand ended up being so much more than I could have anticipated in terms of shaping my faith and my life in so many ways. Today, I thought it would be appropriate for us to listen to some of Jacob's experiences and see how his relationship with travel has shaped his life as well. Also, as a side note, you may occasionally hear some rattling noise on my end. No need to worry, it's just a typhoon. So, Jacob, last time you mentioned that you were thinking of maybe leaning toward international business as a career, but then eventually felt called to the seminary instead. And you were, in the course of that, you were able to incorporate some traveling into your experiences during seminary. How was it that came about?
Sure. Well, it came about through a season during college when I was doing a lot of reading and reflection. My wife, who at the time was my girlfriend, said, "Boy, Jacob, you're talking a lot about theology and reading a lot of books about scripture and theology. Maybe you should consider exploring seminary." And the same was true for my friends. My friends were saying a very similar message. And so I ended up meeting with Katie's former pastor, and we talked a little bit about my journey and how I was feeling stirred and wanting to learn more in these areas. And he really encouraged me to take that seriously. And from his perspective, he felt like it sounded like a calling, a sense of investing in learning about ministry and theology and scripture for the next part of my education. He thought that really sounded like what he was hearing on his end, so he encouraged me to do that. And so that was my springboard, or the change in my trajectory came from that season, and that was towards the end of my undergraduate career. So I, at the time, had applied to a few different programs, but it was after that conversation with him that I really felt that I should apply to seminaries. So I did. But in terms of connecting that with travel, in undergraduate, I was an international relations major. They didn't have an international business degree, but I was kind of drawn to that. And I kept debating what would be a good experience abroad for me, given my interests. I was a French minor, and so for a long time I was thinking of going to a French-speaking country.
Right.
But I ended up one semester working in the International Programs Office, which is the office on campus that pairs students with programs abroad. And so I got to see a lot of literature and what was available. And there was a program with the Rothberg International School connected with the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. And it looked so interesting, but it wasn't an approved program. I would need to get permission from our department chair. And so I met with him and explained to him how interested I was in going to Israel, how I wanted to study the history of the Middle East peace process. And I had written a little bit about it my sophomore year, and so I thought it would be interesting going into junior year, learn more about it. And so he approved that, going to that program. And so I applied and was accepted. And for me, there were several layers to that trip. One, I really wanted to experience another culture and, as I said earlier, learn more about peace process and the history behind it. But I also wanted to visit Israel as part of, in a sense, a pilgrimage that was connected with my faith journey. So that was really interesting to have those different layers. And I had at that point already started learning Hebrew on my own, biblical Hebrew. And then once I was accepted into the program, I started learning modern Hebrew on my own as much as I could.
I see. So I actually, just as an aside, I actually took a semester of Hebrew at Goshen as well, just because I thought it would be interesting of biblical Hebrew.
What did you think?
Yeah, it was taught by Paul Keim, so who was kind of a linguist there, and it was really a lot of fun to actually see these printouts of the Bible, and he's like, okay, congratulations everyone, you just read Genesis 1. Right? It was just really fascinating to touch the Bible in that kind of really deeper, real level in that way.
Oh, for sure. Oh, yes. I just remember like when I first delved into Hebrew, the imagery in the actual root words, because each Hebrew word can be broken down into roots, is often so rich. And we read in English in the beginning, God created heavens and the earth was formless and void. And in Hebrew, you read the sense of the darkness of the ocean, the sense of like a primordial quietness and lack of activity. And, we just gloss over that in English and think, oh, formless and void. We don't think of like this deep like sense of absence of life and activity. And then, the Hebrew makes it alive. Oh, God was really speaking into this reality. So language is beautiful. That one.
Yeah. How much of a sense of power that this word, just this small syllable, 1 or 2 syllables, can have.
Yes.
Right. Yeah. So your trip to Israel, then, it was even before you joined the seminary. Is that correct?
Yes, that's right. That's right. When I decided, that was a point where I was really trying to discern between French and international relations. And I would say that probably this trip abroad helped also my trajectory into seminary. But at this point in the journey, it preceded seminary. So yes, it was really more choosing international relations and traveling and going somewhere else instead of being a French major. I just made it a minor at that point instead of going abroad to France.
Yeah, I see. And then so the design of this program was also intended for better understanding the complexities of what the different political situation in the Middle East, or especially in Israel. Is that
yes? Yes, I took 2 courses when I was there. One was that very thing, the history of the Middle East peace process, which also involves a history of the conflict and the factors that led up to the various moments, and but then also modern Hebrew. We did what they called an ulpan, which was like an immersion program in modern Hebrew. It was 5 days a week, and you live there on campus and walk to class every day. And as you're walking to class, you see these beautiful stone buildings and people are all around you speaking Hebrew. And then you go into class and it's almost exclusively in Hebrew. And so it was a great way to dive in and learn.
Right.
And there is a huge amount of overlap between modern Hebrew and biblical Hebrew because it essentially was reintroduced as a modern language with the foundation of the state of Israel. And so they had to create a lot of words for modern things that didn't exist in biblical Hebrew to kind of launch it as a modern language. And so a lot of things carried over. There's one really interesting example. The word for electricity in modern Hebrew is inspired by the word in Hebrew describing the glory that surrounds God. As you look at God, there's this sense of glory or emanating out from. And one of those words in Hebrew inspired the modern Hebrew word for electricity. So even if you are just a modern Hebrew speaker and you look at the Bible, you see certain words and be like, and there was electricity surrounding. You could extrapolate, you could by reverse, into the ancient, but it's really interesting.
Wow. Yeah. Oh, wow. That really is fascinating. Last time we kind of talked about maybe as Thailand being my first kind of real trip abroad and instances of culture shock. Did you have any? Did you feel more prepared for your trip there, or did you find quite a few things that ended up being surprising or unexpected?
Oh, for sure, I did have culture shock, and I came back actually a little bit depressed from that trip because I think I tend to be an optimistic person in general, and so I was going to study the peace process, which, at the time in 2000, I don't know how much you remember or our listeners remember, but Israel at that time had a very open and positive leader, Ehud Barak, who was pursuing the peace process very, very fervently. In fact, it made it like a central part of his work. And so they had this really interesting, potentially breakthrough meeting at Camp David with Yasser Arafat and
Yeah.
Ehud Barak, and they had this like funny moment where they were going into a room at the same time and they were jostling to see who would let the other go first. And it was like, is this potentially some moment of breakthrough? If ever, this seems like the greatest opportunity. And so there was a lot of optimism at the time. And it was like, oh, I'm studying this, things are unfolding. It's historic. And then right as I was leaving, there was a renewed intifada, which is that Arabic word for uprising, which was essentially meaning there was another breakdown in the dialogue and the peace process. And eventually Ehud Barak was voted out, and a more hardline leader, Benjamin Netanyahu, came back in, and it just felt so sad. And the other thing is that it's interesting at the university having a mix of Israeli and Palestinian classmates. There were common areas at night where people would be spending time like out in the courtyard talking, and you got to hear people's stories, and just seeing the depth of pain from both sides, from the years of tension and the sense of displacement from the Palestinians and from the Israelis, the sense of acts of violence from certain factions in the Palestinian group. And then I met Palestinian Christians who felt like a double minority, who weren't accepted by Jews or their Arab neighbors, they felt. And I just came away profoundly saddened, and it definitely challenged me too, having been in the majority of my home culture for many years growing up in the Midwest. I definitely felt like, oh, this is a chance for me to listen more. And so, yeah, culture shock came in a lot of ways, but I think it was partly the shock of not being in the main group and then seeing these tensions and being powerless to change it, and recognizing that my naivete coming in of hope that the situation would be resolved was really misplaced. A lot of people afterwards said, Jacob, you don't seem yourself, because I think probably for a month or two I was just really kind of quiet and down. It was from that experience. And I don't know if you had this too, when you come back after meeting friends and learning about a new culture, and you've experienced so much, and it's hard to convey that to your family and friends back home. And there's a certain sadness in that too, I think. You've had this experience, but it's hard to communicate, and you're kind of mourning a change. But in terms of like some of the more basic things, like we think of food or clothing, in a lot of ways, Israel has a lot of westernized practices and tendencies. So food was very similar to me. There were more Mediterranean type options like pita and falafel, and a lot of cucumber and tomatoes and hummus. But those were delicious, fresh and good. But there were a lot of other food items that were familiar to me, so I didn't have as much shock there. And clothing styles were very similar.
I guess I should also ask, how long was the program? Was it a semester or a year, or?
It was basically just a summer term. Yeah. So
I see.
Yeah. So I had 2 courses over the summer. So it would have been really from beginning to end about 2 months. So
I see.
Yeah.
And did you spend basically all of your time just around campus, or did you have the chance to travel a bit?
I did have the chance to travel. Yes. I had mentioned before that part of this for me was in a sense a pilgrimage. And so in my mind, I had hoped before going that I could see a lot of sites that we hear about in the New Testament of where Jesus ministered or walked or lived. And so I took a trip to the Galilee region in Israel around Lake Gennesaret. And it was so beautiful to see the rolling hills and the lake itself, particularly in the evening when around sunset. A beautiful lake, and surrounded by these small towns. And in a lot of these small towns, there are pilgrimage sites where they commemorate certain events that happen. They don't know for sure whether 100% historically they happen in those spots, but they're essentially places to go to remember them. So there's a church that's dedicated to Jesus's teaching of the Beatitudes, and it's in a beautiful location overlooking the lake, and there are these lush gardens beside it. And so we got to go there, and then to the place where the Jordan River flows into the Sea of Galilee, and to see what the Jordan looked like. It was a lot smaller than I thought, but it was really interesting. Yes. We also traveled north to Mount Hermon, the tallest mountain in Israel, and there was still some snow up there when we got to the top, which was really interesting in the summertime, to see a little bit of snow. It was beautiful. You could ride ski lifts up there, and also traveled to the Dead Sea and floated in the Dead Sea a little bit. And there's some interesting sites around there. Masada, this old Jewish fort that you could go up essentially a rock path to get to, and
Right.
Qumran, where they found the Dead Sea Scrolls.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then we traveled to a Bedouin camp further out in the desert regions of Israel. We went to the Sinai Peninsula and
wow.
hiked up Mount Sinai and saw the sunrise from the top of Mount Sinai, which was breathtaking. And
Really?
there was a
Oh,
large group from Korea singing hymns in Korean at the top
really?
of the mountain. Yeah,
Oh,
when we
wow.
got there, it was amazing.
Wow.
Everybody was so friendly and like passing out cereal bars to each other.
No kidding.
Yeah, it was really a special moment. And then
Wow.
I was also able to travel into Egypt. And I know you said last week that you really
Oh,
wanted to
yes,
see
that's
Egypt.
right.
So we
That's right.
went to
Yeah.
Cairo, Memphis, and Saqqara and saw some of the ancient
Wow.
site pyramids and the Sphinx and some of the old architectural, wonders. So that was
Yes.
very special. And then back to Israel. So yeah, I was able to see a lot of things in Israel that were special.
Mm.
We went into some of the Palestinian-controlled areas too,
Oh, wow.
and Bethlehem. Saw the Church of the
Mm.
Nativity, which was beautiful, and
Oh,
they
wow.
have a crypt or a low place where they have this
Yeah.
silver star, and in it is a container holding oil, and that's where they commemorate the birthplace of Jesus. And
Wow.
that was special, yes. And I went to Nablus, and I went to a few other
Mm.
areas controlled. Oh, what would have been in the biblical times in Samaria, where Jesus had the conversation with the Samaritan woman, and
Yeah.
so Mount Gerizim was there,
Yeah.
and that was fascinating. What I was struck by was the mixture of Christian and Jewish and Muslim holy sites in all these areas,
Yeah.
different spots around, and the mixture of ancient and modern, really, really old buildings, and then right next to it, some modern store or neon lights hanging on something. It's a really fascinating mixture there in the Holy Land.
That is really an interesting way to put it. How trying to keep the ancient and the past and the holy aspect of it together, while still understanding that they have to, make room for
Yes.
the modern things of
Yes.
life today too. Yeah. Are you familiar with the DVD series or the study series that the world may know? Where I think it's a historian or an archaeologist taking a group around different tells in Israel that were relevant to the Bible and teaching about things that happened to the Bible while at those places.
I've heard of that, but I've not seen it. Is it good? Do you recommend it?
So myself as I studied history, and for me it was just fantastic and fascinating to see these different places relevant to the Old Testament and New Testament, and really makes it come me, especially like seeing the olive presses at the different towns, and that those olive presses are called a Gethsemane. Yeah.
Yes.
And so
I think that the whole area is so interesting because there are roads that you can walk on past this olive grove area, this olive tree area, down into a valley, and then you walk up into the city of David, that older part of the old city where the Temple Mount is. And there's a beautiful church that is built beside this garden area where they commemorate where Jesus prayed the night of his arrest. In that church, it was so different architecturally than any of the other ones. The ceiling was painted as a night sky with dark tones of blue, and it had stars. And I don't know if they were trying to capture the sense of like this event took place at night, and so they were trying to represent even the inner part of the sanctuary with this sense of a nighttime. But that was one of my favorite churches, just the way that when you enter the space, how it drew you in and represented that moment with art in different places around the building, and just sitting. It was so quiet there in that garden area, and a very holy place. And on the outside of it, there is a mosaic on the top of the church of Jesus praying, and it's like it has vibrant colors for his cloak and what the others are wearing, but his expression is interesting. It's very serious. Like you can tell he's going through a time of struggle, but it also has this kind of transcendence to it. Like this is incredibly difficult. It's overwhelming, but I have this sense that this is leading somewhere that it will overcome what I'm going through. And so it's one of those places of all the sites I saw where the art really captured the ethos or the feeling of what you might think that the place is trying to signify. There are two sites in Jerusalem where they commemorate the burial of Jesus, and one of them is held by, I think it's 3 or 4 different churches, the Catholic Church and 2 different types of Eastern Orthodox churches. And then the third type is maybe Armenian, which is also Orthodox, but it is a different branch. And they share it. It's the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. And I remember going in there. And so because it's shared, the different parts of the church they have a different aesthetic based on the tradition of the group. But it's very somber and dark, and it feels like more similar to a tomb. But then you go down into the base, and I remember spending time there and thinking, this is very heavy and serious. And then I went to the Garden Tomb, which is another place that commemorates his burial place, and it's full of beautiful flowers, and it's open, and there's a little place where you can enter where a stone is rolled away, and that you can see a burial spot, and it's just like a lighter color stone, and it feels more celebratory, like more the feeling of resurrection. I thought, how interesting, 2 sites commemorating the same thing, but 2 very different experiences based on the space. So
it seems, your time in Israel and going to all these different sites related to the Bible, it's kind of like a softball, like an easy question coming up here, how did this relate to your faith and your journey in faith? But, how do you think, did it unpacking, was it almost too much to take in at once? Did it take you quite a while to unpack all of these different sites into it?
Yes.
And how they kind of personally impacted?
Yes, I think it did. It was too much to take in all at once. And I guess a lot of experiences in life can be that way, and over time you unpack them more. But I definitely think there was a point where I was taking so many things in, and I wanted to, and it was very meaningful. But then I think I did get overwhelmed. And I remember sitting in the computer lab in the Boyer building on campus and writing an email to my uncle. And I started crying as I was writing him, because I had this deep sense of, like, I've gone to these places because I was looking for something, to connect with God, to have some deeper insight. And I kind of came to this feeling of being overwhelmed and feeling like I just needed to remember that I could meet with God anywhere, like in my backyard or in the Boyer building where I was typing, like God was present there. And I had this sense of, I don't know if you want to say disillusionment, but this sense of, boy, I've gone to all these places trying to capture this experience, but I missed the point that a place like that isn't needed. Like God can meet you where you are. And it was very meaningful to me. And as I was crying, I think I was also unleashing some of that inner struggle of being away from home and missing my family, and also trying to process all this, and as a young adult and not having traveled much. And it came out in this email. I still have the email. My mom printed it. My uncle this date shows the date of that era. They faxed a copy to my parents, and they kept the fax in a photo album. So I still have the photo album. Actually, it's right here. Wow. I was looking through it before our time here. But anyway, to answer your question, I think for sure I felt overwhelmed, and I still every once in a while will think back on something from that time and have a new insight on it. So it's still continuing to bless me. But I think for sure it had an impact. It definitely made me appreciate the chance to visit physical locations related to events, and to have things demystified a little bit, and to realize that biblical events unfolded in real human space, just like the world we inhabit where we are. And I appreciated the beauty of the place. And so now when I read stories in my mind, I have a reference point for certain things and think, I can remember, that was so beautiful. I can imagine that lake that's behind them, or I can imagine them hiking in this spot or standing here. And that's meaningful. But I think it did stretch me overall to want to be more interested in reconciliation between people. When I saw Palestinian friends and Israeli friends at an impasse, and the hurt getting between them, and knowing I couldn't do anything to improve that, it made me just look to God more and cry out and ask for God's help and intervention and healing in our world, and want that, and be committed to praying for and seeking reconciliation as a main part of my faith journey between people. I think that's still something I carry with me, the desire to work at reconciliation, and is a big part of the church tradition that I'm in now. Reconciliation and peacemaking is such a huge part of the Mennonite church, and that resonates with me, kind of going back to that experience. And I think the sense of pilgrimage it was fulfilled. Like I felt like I did have a lot of holy moments and encounters with God, but also came back feeling, as I said earlier, that pilgrimage can happen even in your own place. We talk about like staycations or being where you are and having a posture of doing stuff differently. You can have pilgrimage right where you are. That was a meaningful insight.
Yeah, I'm really glad that you mentioned about your classmates. I thought I was going to come up with this really insightful question and asking you about whether or not that also impacted your journey in faith. But then, of course, you touched on it, so that was really great. One thought that came to my mind, and I don't know what you think about this while you were talking, especially about writing the email, is it made me think of maybe there's an analogy there between when the curtain in the temple was torn down, kind of us being able to see, I think we could easily see these holy sites and these sites dedicated to events in the Bible and kind of really hold them with real reverence for the power that they hold. But in a way, just like you said, they're kind of with the tearing, just as with the tearing down of the curtain, with the curtain tearing temple, kind of letting God be so accessible to everyone, like you say, just no matter where you are, and beautiful and awe-inspiring, amazing as those places I think must be, and I would love to see them too. We can't forget that it's just as meaningful to have moments of connection with God. Like you say, writing an email or mowing our lawn or washing the dishes or wherever we may be.
Absolutely. Yes, I agree with that 100%. Sometimes we are searching and feel like we have to go far away to find what we're looking for. But if there's, like you said, a basic message to bring home to that is that we can encounter God and change and renewal and new insight right where we are. And often what we're looking for can be encountered right in front of us, the daily simple things. It's hidden to see, but it's there.
Yeah, really. Maybe a way to wrap up a little bit, how did you feel when your trip was over and you were back? Did you feel that the trip had a real significant role to play in your deciding to enter into the seminary instead of international relations?
Yes, I think it magnified my interest in Hebrew and going deeper in scripture and history and theology. And there were a lot of interesting conversations that I had then with people from many different backgrounds. There were a lot of seminary students who were there when I was attending at the Hebrew University, so I had interesting conversations with them or with my Jewish or Palestinian friends, and questions came up about God or about faith, and those types of questions you carry with you, and I wanted to explore them more, and seminary was a great way to do that. In fact, I remember having a conversation with some Lutheran students who were in seminary at the time, and they said, you need to go to seminary. And I said, I think that I could probably explore these questions on my own. I could have probably a job, and that they looked at me real skeptically, and they're like, we really think you need to explore these in seminary.
Really?
So I guess, and how they think about it, there were seeds, there were other people, earlier before my junior year who had seen certain things happening, recommending that. But anyway, in terms of an impact, yes, it contributed towards that. I think there was a great sense of humbling for me, coming back, feeling like the world is larger than I knew. There's a lot more suffering in the world than I knew, which increased my posture towards trying to be empathetic and listen and consider other people's stories and suffering. I had heard a lot about the Israeli-Palestinian narrative from a pro-Israeli standpoint, from a certain angle, and I still, after going, continue to think about and listen to the Israeli side of things from my friends, but I also heard a whole new side of it, of the perspective from Palestinian friends. So coming back and realizing how complex and nuanced problems and challenges can be, not as black and white. So I think it maybe made me view the broader world in maybe a more nuanced way. Like I said, I was an optimist going into it. I still am, but I was definitely more, I guess you would say, I had some elements of realism poured over me, and I had to come back and deal with that. And anytime you see suffering, I think come back hopefully more empathetic and trying to work for positive outcomes where you are and to help people where you are. So I think that helped me grow for sure.
Yeah, boy, it has just been fantastic time today, and I'm kind of seeing some overlap between some of the stories that I touched on last week in me talking about Thailand, and especially how these trips that we take or these things that we do, we maybe go in with some expectations and think some things and maybe expect, maybe try to anticipate what the end result will be. And then we see God's hand working and, in some ways definitely leading us other ways. And it's just interesting how in our case that it happened to be travel, overseas travel, that was kind of the catalyst for this in our life. Me personally, I'm really looking forward to unpacking more of our stories together as we continue this podcast. And I'm really thankful for hearing all of these great things that you mentioned about today. Anything that you want to close with?
Yes, just for our listeners, if they have any ideas, questions, or things that they'd like to suggest that they could respond to our podcast when we post it, and also to encourage them if they haven't gone abroad and they have the opportunity to consider it and to not just shy away from the opportunity because it's intimidating or different. But often I think when you get out of your comfort zone and try something like that, it's very transformative and positive. And so I just encourage any of our listeners who haven't gone abroad, if they get the chance, to try to pursue.
Yeah. I completely agree. And probably they'll find other people encouraging them and able to support them in that. Today, this has been our second episode of the Two World Podcast, and I personally thank you for taking the time to listen. And I hope that you find that it was enriching for you as it has been for me. And I hope also that you're looking forward to the next episode.